Hey everybody, this is Tim Chaves from Faith Matters. For today's episode, we're releasing a conversation that we recorded in collaboration with Kurt Frankum from Leading Saints. Our guest was Paul Peterson, the CEO of the OCD and Anxiety Treatment Center. When we released episode 65 on OCD and Scrupulosity with Bonnie Young about a year ago, we were astonished at the number of people that reached out to us to share their own experiences with OCD. Some had been diagnosed and knew what to call it, but others related their own experiences without ever having understood that what they were suffering from was OCD. Latter-day Saints often start by explaining its symptoms in religious language or looking only to religious solutions to solve it. Chances are there is certainly someone in your life who is struggling with OCD, and it could be much more severe than you might have imagined based on the depictions of OCD in the media. As you'll hear from Paul, OCD is a very serious mental illness, and it's very, very common for OCD sufferers to experience severe depression and even suicidal thoughts. This episode was originally created as part of the Single Saints Summit, which focused on the experience of unmarried members of the church, and you'll hear references to those experiences specifically, but the conversation was very broad in its scope, and we thought that Paul did as good a job as we have ever heard, truly articulating the experience of someone with OCD and the science-backed way to treat it. To those who are listening who are suffering from OCD, we want to emphasize that there is a light at the end of the tunnel. We know that when you're in the depths of it, that feels impossible, but please understand that qualified specialists really can treat OCD to the extent that it becomes nothing more than a nuisance. It doesn't have to rule or ruin your life. And of course, if you know someone who may be suffering from OCD, please feel free to share this episode with them. Since OCD has affected our lives so deeply, we want to spread as widely as possible any information that can lead to the diagnosis and treatment. Thanks as always for listening, and now we'll jump right in.
Hello and welcome back to another session of the Single Saints Virtual Summit. Today we have quite a group on here. Joining us, some co-hosts, some presenters, and my name is Kurt Frankum, and I'll have the opportunity to be one of the hosts of this session. And we have Tim and Aubrey Chaves from the Faith Matters podcast, and which we're joining efforts to create this summit. And so, Tim and Aubrey, how are you two?
Great, thank you.
Good to see you, Kurt.
Yeah. And we have Paul Peterson, who is our guest expert, I guess you could say. And Paul, we're glad that you're part of this discussion today.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk with you guys today.
Awesome. Now, just we're going to turn some time over to Paul to do a presentation here, and then, but Tim and Aubrey, you may remember our discussion we had with them during the Mentally Healthy Saints Virtual Summit, where Tim talked about his experience with OCD, and they also have a child that has OCD. And Tim, your experience was more in the context of scrupulosity or religious OCD. Is anything you'd add to that? Or
yeah, no, that's right. No, for sure. I think the time that it affected me most was on my mission, and obviously missions can be very rule-oriented environments, and so the scrupulosity there for me was fairly severe. It's continued to affect me throughout my life, but and in many different ways. If you sort of like looked at the laundry list of ways that OCD can manifest, I would say that I've probably touched on almost all of them, but in with varying levels of severity. That being said, there are I think the things that Paul's going to talk about are exactly straight down the middle. What's really helped me and has helped our child that you've mentioned with OCD. So I'm extremely excited to hear what Paul has to say.
Yeah, and as we were putting this together, I first came in contact with Amy, who we were hoping to have on this recording, but there's some connection issues. So we'll definitely loop her in either in a separate recording or later on. But she brought up this concept that I'd never heard about, which is relationship OCD. Now, I don't believe, and Paul, you'll talk more to this. I don't think that's a specific diagnosis per se, maybe just a different way that OCD is manifest in life. So Paul, I'll pass the timer to you. Maybe you can unpack some of these concepts, especially in the context of single adults, since that's the theme of our summit here, and maybe how it impacts them and their relationships and whatnot. So you maybe give us some of your background, and then let's go.
Well, yeah. So I'm Paul Peterson. I actually am the CEO of the OCD and Anxiety Treatment Center, where we've got a location in South Jordan and one in Bountiful. And where my journey really started was where my own son was struggling with OCD, and it was. I was a therapist at that time, and I was using all my little techniques that I had learned, but they weren't working with him. And also he was 18 months old, and his symptoms got really terrible, and I was desperate to help him. And I stumbled upon the International OCD Foundation.org website. And if you have OCD, you should go to their site. They're a nonprofit. They are the hub of all that is OCD. So any true specialist with OCD are affiliated with them. I kind of see them as like the National Association of Hearts, you know. If a heart doctor isn't a member, they probably shouldn't be working on your heart. But I ran into them, and then truly like 2 to 3 weeks later, I found myself in Washington, D.C. at a conference, and it was life-changing. I think this was around 2010 or so, and I came back and I'm like, oh my goodness, I've been ruining my clients. I was using all these techniques that everybody told me that I should use, like 2 pauses for negative. Let's breathe. Let's teach you how to change your thinking process. Let's reassure you. Let me explore your past and look at how that connects. It didn't do anything. I remember my supervisor even said, oh, get a rubber band and have them flick their wrist, and that will help neutralize their feelings. And it didn't work. And in fact, actually, I remember using these techniques with client after client, and it would make them feel so good when I'd use these techniques, but they would only last as long as until they got to their car, and then their brain reset, and it was back to square one. And what I learned from this conference was that what we're really dealing with is not necessarily a mental health issue. We're dealing with a physical health issue. And I actually have a scan that I want to share with you guys. And in this scan, I don't know if you can see it on the screen there. Perfect. So as you can see here, here is a normal control. This is somebody who doesn't have OCD. And then this is somebody who has OCD. You can see the frontal cortex is just lit up like a Christmas tree. So much energy. But here's the thing is, all those other people that you hear saying, oh, I'm so OCD, well, guess what? This is what their brain looks like. They look like the normal control brain. And so what we're dealing with here is a physical health issue. Now, when somebody who, everybody on this planet has heard of OCD, but they don't understand what that actually means. See, OCD, so we know there's this physiological issue happening. In fact, it really stems, as far as we understand, it stems in the amygdala, which is the fight or flight of our brain, and it sends this message incorrectly to the frontal cortex. So when somebody says, "Oh, I'm so OCD," you say, "Wait a second. So are you afraid? Are you worried? Are you concerned?" And they may be like, well, no, I just like things straight, or I like things organized. And it's like, oh, you don't understand what OCD actually is. See, people who have OCD, they call them the silent sufferers. Have you guys ever heard of that term before? The silent sufferers. And I remember the first time I ever heard this, I'm like, whoa, that's quite a big word to be using. And the more I got into it, I'm like, oh my gosh, they do. What happens is this person gets an intrusive thought. Now, what's interesting is these thoughts are the same type of thoughts that everybody else has. The only difference is their brain is not filtering that thought like everybody else's brain. So using a scale 0 to 10, 10 being the highest level of distress I could feel, 0 not feeling anything at all, here I'm minding my business, all of a sudden I get this thought that everyone else gets, except the only difference is my brain just shot up to a 9, a 10, a 12 out of 10, redlining. And here's the thing is, you typically in life, you don't feel something for nothing. So if I feel a 10 out of 10 because I walked past a little child and I think, oh my gosh, did I want to hurt that child? Well, I'm LDS. I want to do what's right. And is that the spirit guiding me, telling me that maybe I did something? I mean, I got a 10 there. 10 is pain. You get the adrenaline rushing through your brain, your body, your arms, your face, your heart's racing. It hurts. So somebody who has OCD, it hurts. Now, here's the other difference is that the rest of the world who doesn't have OCD, they can get triggered. A thought can come in their head or their mind, and it sparks them. But on average, that emotion lasts between 7 to 20 seconds, and then it's over, and we move on. But somebody with OCD, they could feel it for a whole hour. Have you ever had a 10 out of 10 that lasted one entire hour? How about a day? How about a whole week? How about if it lasted one whole month? You're at a 10 out of 10, or you're at a 7 out of 10. It is just not stopping. How about a year? How about years? And the thing is that for most of these people, they can't tell you what they're worrying about because you might freak out. There are, you talked about relationship OCD. There's lots of subsets of OCD. There's one OCD. What you worry about, and this is a very important thing for anyone listening today. If you do have OCD and your brain is triggering and it's not stopping, what you worry about is not your problem. Your problem is that your brain is lying to your body and saying that something is happening that is not actually happening. And because it hits to the reasoning part of the brain, it feels so real. And that's where you got your obsessions. They obsess about things, but then there's the compulsions. And the compulsions is like, they've got to know. In our facility, we trademarked the term live uncertain. Anybody who truly has OCD, the idea to not know, it's the kryptonite. They have to know. And so when somebody does that compulsion, it's not because of, they're so silly, it doesn't hurt at all. No. Think about it. If you were terrorized, your feelings of awful, horrible emotion rushing through your body, and you are trying to figure out, wait, did I hurt that child? Wait a second, maybe I was standing over here. Maybe I was thinking this. Maybe no, and I'm trying to create that certainty. And until I can create certainty, I will continue to suffer. And so I will do a compulsion. The compulsion, now, and here's another thing, is that so many people think that OCD has to do with physical things like checking, counting, washing. And I'm telling you, in our clinic, 5%. Maybe 10%, I won't even say 10%, any between 5 and less than 10% have those. And the rest are these mental obsessions and mental compulsions, or they become physical, but they don't even realize they're becoming physical because they hurt. They got to create some level of relief. And it becomes almost addictive to try to get that relief. So when somebody says, I'm so OCD, you're like, so are you terrorized? And it goes on day after day? No. And that's one thing I've tried to educate people, like you don't even realize how disrespectful that is to somebody who actually has OCD. It's so painful. And the reality is the world has no idea. They watch Monk and they think Monk is funny because he does all these things. But if you actually watch Monk and you pay attention to him, he does not think it's funny at all. He is absolutely suffering. Tony Shalhoub, he nailed it. He nailed it perfectly. He did his homework to know what somebody feels with OCD. And what's so sad is what it's done is train the world to think it's funny, and they laugh at it. And in fact, actually, I had two winters ago, I saw this lady, she had this shirt and it says, I'm so OCD. It had an acronym, Obsessive Christmas Disorder. And I walked up to her, and I shouldn't have done this. I repented since. But I walked up to her and I said, where'd you get your shirt? And she said, I found it online. I'm like, I want to get one that has a cool acronym, like I'm so Downs, like Down syndrome. And she said, that's not very funny. And I said, neither is yours. Can you imagine making fun of Down syndrome? Nobody would tolerate it. they would go irate, but somehow OCD, it's just funny. It isn't funny, it's serious. And here's the thing is that, like I said, what you worry about is not the problem. The problem is the brain's triggering incorrectly. And so what could somebody worry about with OCD? It's irrelevant. So if you're going to a therapist and you're trying to explore that, you're wasting your time. It's irrelevant. What is relevant is your brain just shot up an 8 when anybody else who had that exact same thought would not have shot up. I mean, I personally have had terrible thoughts. I've had horrible thoughts. Could I push that person off the bridge? Could I have an affair? Could I hurt somebody? Could I run somebody off the road? Could I plunge this knife into somebody's back? I've had those thoughts. The only difference is when I have those thoughts, they last for like half a second. I get no anxiety at all about it, and I move on. But the person with OCD, they do. And so there is one, you talked about relationship OCD. Well, relationship OCD is, like I said, is just that subtype. You maybe you're in a relationship and you get, you have the same thoughts. Like even me, the night after, I got married and I looked at my wife and I'm like, oh my gosh, did I make the wrong choice? And I probably was like a 1 or a 2. And it lasted for like 10, 15 seconds, and then it was over. But somebody with relationship OCD, they may be like, they're a 20 out of 10. They look at the person and they're like, oh my gosh, am I attracted to them? Do I think that, do I feel in love with them? Could I spend the rest of my life with them? And they start doubting it. And there's actually, there's a specialist who coined the term, the doubter's disease. OCD is called, they call it the doubter's disease. You truly doubt everything. Because truly, if all of a sudden I'm an 8 out of 10, that this thought just said, oh, you might have just touched this person inappropriately. Like, wait, did I? I'm an 8 right now. The last time I was an 8, that car was jetting towards me, and it was valuable to have that 8. But it's not, because what people will find out is that all these things that have consumed their brain, overtaken their life, has never actually happened. These terrible things, like, okay, so if you get into the wrong relationship, and so what? Do you love them or do you not? Like, why do I need the same feeling as if somebody's running at me with a machete when I'm thinking, oh my gosh, am I attracted to them? And that's the thing, is like I've worked with so many LDS members who are in their 30s or 40s, never got married because relationship after relationship after relationship, they've burned them out. That they could have married them, they should have married them. But what happened is that they started doubting it. They were terrified. That emotion's there, it's not going away. And then when they're out of a relationship, they typically don't have any of those feelings again. And they're like, oh, a reprieve. But then they get in a relationship, bam, I'm questioning, I'm worried, I'm concerned, I'm not sure. What if? I call it the 4 F-bombs of OCD. I'm worried, I'm concerned, I'm not sure, I'm wondering what if. Like, most people who don't have OCD, they're not living that. They're just living life. They live in the moment. But the brain wants you to be in the past, or it wants you to be in the future. And I'm telling you, if you read the scriptures, there is none that says, thou shalt focus on thy future. Thou shalt beat thyself up all the days of thine life. Through terror, fear, and worry and concern, you'll know the truth of all things. That's not what it is. God is not going to scare you to death to be obedient. And so kind of going back to lots of different OCD. So like, there's harm OCD. I'm worried that I'm harming somebody mentally or physically. There's pedophile OCD. I'm worried that I'm going to sexually abuse a child. There's homosexual OCD. I'm terrified that I might be gay or transgender. I might be transgender. Or I've actually even worked with somebody who's transgender, and they were worried that they were straight. Like, the brain, whatever you care about. I actually have said this for years. OCD is like this parasite. It goes into the core of who you are. It finds what you value the most and then exploits it. And so what do you care about? Well, and that's the thing, is that this is what I care about today, but somebody with OCD, in a week, in a month, in a year, the topics change. but the terror, the fear, the worry, the concern that they have doesn't. And so it's like, oh, this one that used to hijack your life doesn't hijack your life anymore, but this one does, and it hurts just as much or even more. And in fact, what we've found is that people, when they're doing their compulsions, they actually are confirming threat. They're confirming there's value to what they're worried about. And the problem is that the brain thinks it's doing a good thing for you then. I'm protecting you. And so what we find is people with OCD, it's kind of like ebbs and flows. Sometimes it's better, sometimes it's worse. But over time, it goes to a slight up, and it just gets a little worse, a little worse, a little worse over time. Plus, as you get older, your ability to deal with stress becomes less. I think some people believe it's the myelin sheath around the nerve endings start to thin, and that phrase, my nerves are shot, my nerves are thinning out. It's a real thing. But nonetheless, so going back to different types, so I mentioned the harm OCD. How about sensory OCD? I'm worried about different feelings or sounds. How about, there is contamination OCD, but let me tell you a new one. Most people just think that this is just about washing hands, but did you know there's emotional contamination? There is also disgust. That is not about getting sick, that they're worried about, that it's just gross, and they have the same feeling as somebody's running at them with a machete because this gross thing might be near them. Or emotional contamination, like, oh, that city there, that person, that thing I've got to be away from. And again, I get that large, huge emotion that rushes through me that confirms there's value to it. And so, and then another one that I was asked to talk about was scrupulosity. Now, a lot of people in the church, you'll see they'll have scrupulosity. I'll tell you, my experience has been that scrupulosity is not there because you are a member of the church. Scrupulosity, again, it goes to what you value. So I'm valuing being good, doing good, and so it's going to attack that. But I have lots of people that's scrupulosity is not it. It's oh, I'm worried about putting my baby in the oven, and I got to go check my oven over and over and over. I'm worried about putting my cat in the oven or in the refrigerator, and I got to go check my refrigerator. And but scrupulosity is interesting. You got a moral or spiritual form of scrupulosity, and so it doesn't all have to be spiritual. There could be just the moral. I've had people who don't even believe in God. They're like, oh my gosh, why do I have scrupulosity? I don't even believe in it. I don't even believe, I don't care. I think we're going to go back to dust, and that's it. That's the end. And why do I care about whether I lied or didn't lie? And so, but scrupulosity, you have things such as, did I just put that thing in my pocket? I feel like I might have stolen it. Or, did I tell the truth? Did I tell the whole truth? They may feel like, they may feel like they need to go talk to their bishop. And by the way, I've talked to so many people. They've talked to their bishops over and over and over, and the bishop is trying to help them. And the reason why they do it is because, here they'll purge all this information. The bishop's like, yeah, that's not worthy of anything. Like, you're good, you're fine. And they feel so much better. They get that relief. And that's what happens. That's part of that compulsion, is sometimes they get that relief, and it reinforces the desire to do that when they're in that state of being. Well, they get that relief, but then their brain, because of the malfunction is still there, they've got to go back, because their brain will be like, did I tell him everything? Maybe I didn't tell him this. And if I had told him this, would he have said this to me? Maybe he would have punished me had I given him the full story. So I go give him more of the full story. And then I leave and I feel so much better. But then the brain goes again. And then I got to go back. And in fact, I'd say the first person I ever worked with OCD when I wasn't treating it correctly, he actually had been in the MTC for 3 days, burning out as branch president because of something that he had done, which was like this little itty bitty thing. And 3 days later, he had to leave. And for what? because he was such a good person. He wants to do the right thing, but doing the right thing, it wasn't important. I mean, it was irrelevant. And so with scrupulosity, so, and then it can hit just lots of different ways. Now, I'm going to tell you, there is a treatment for OCD. If you understand, okay, this is what my OCD, this is what I got, this is what I'm feeling, there is a way out. And I'm going to be honest with you, is that very few people on this planet have the skill set to help somebody who has OCD. It's interesting. You go to the International OCD Foundation. They did a study several years ago, and they found that it takes anywhere between 14 to 17 years to find somebody who actually has the capacity to help you. It's that infrequent because, when we go to school, they teach us David Burns, 10 forms of stinking thinking. Let's do emotional, emotional regulation. Let's do all these other things. They're irrelevant. It's not going to help. I mean, I talked to somebody a little bit ago who, their bishop was telling them that they just need to serve more. And I'm like, oh my goodness, like my mom has congestive heart failure. And that's what I do to her when she's, feeling really dizzy. I'm like, well, have you served today? Nobody would be like, wait, are you really telling me to serve and that's going to make my heart better? It's irrelevant, although it's a great thing to do, but it's not going to change the problem. And so, but what will change the problem is exposure and response prevention. It is scientifically proven to be the most beneficial treatment than any other. So if you are going to treatment for OCD and they're not doing exposures with you, it's not going to do anything. I promise you, you will go to therapy for decades. And it is nice to have somebody championing your cause. It's nice to have somebody who gives you encouragement, who tells you that they're going to help you. But by the end of the time you're with them, I guarantee you would be able to say what they did was maybe awesome. I love my therapist, but it never changed what was happening in my brain. Do exposure and response prevention correctly, your brain will begin to change. And so what the idea is with exposure and response prevention is that we need to change the way you react to scary things. We need your brain to learn that it's just being duped. Think of it this way. If somebody had schizophrenia and they see somebody, maybe they've got a 16-year-old girl following them around as a hallucination, yelling at them, screaming, and would I tell them like, man, have you talked to her about how that makes you feel? No. Talking to the hallucination isn't going to do anything. OCD, it's not schizophrenia. You're not seeing things, you're not hearing things, but you feel it. You feel it just as real as somebody who does have schizophrenia. He feels that they're seeing somebody. It feels so real. The difference is that somebody with schizophrenia, they actually have zero insight. They actually do believe it's all true. It was like, oh yeah, I went to the train depot, smashed 2 trains together, killed everybody, and I felt terrible. And you're like, how did you do that? You're too small. Calling me a liar? That's schizophrenic. OCD is like, I think I might have crashed the trains. I feel like I might have. I need to just go check to make sure. It's like the hit and run OCD. I've got to go check to make sure I didn't go hit things or go look and see things. But anyway, so these exposures, what I'm going to do is I'm going to begin to expose myself to my fear in a methodical way. And as I do that, what will happen is my brain is going to trigger. It's going to say, what are you doing? This is bad news. Like, what if you become that person? What if you are that? What if that thing does happen? But what if you don't change it? What if you do nothing to neutralize that emotion? Well, what will happen is your brain will say, didn't you feel that 7 out of 10 I just gave you? Maybe this 8 or 9 will make you change your way. Just go check or go do that thing or ask that thing or think that thing. and just to make sure you get that relief. But what if you don't? Well, what happens is the brain begins to learn something new, and a lot of times this habituation thing happens where that distress level will actually come down. We're not necessarily looking for that to be, it's just a nice side effect most of the time. But what's cool is I do it a lot. And that's the thing, is that I've got to train my brain to react differently. So if I did one exposure today, one tomorrow, one in 4 days from now, I can't expect that anything's going to change in my brain. Because, how many exposures do I need to do before this doesn't bother me? How many over here, how many do I need to do before this not bothering me? How about on the whole spectrum, I can just be doing this one and randomly just doing, and they're not bothering me. And that's what happens, but you have to do it a lot, because it's like a physical therapy to your brain. You're changing the way your brain is reacting to the scary things. And so we do that, and we create randomization. In fact, actually, in the last 2 or 3 years, inhibitory learning is a huge breakthrough, which is creating randomization in your exposures, which most people don't know about it. But if they're research based in their treatment, they will. And it's been a game changer for us to at our facilities to do that. And so so let me give you an example of an exposure, and specifically to scrupulosity. So let's say my fear is that I am having maybe I'm having sexual thoughts about Jesus. That's actually amazing how often that one happens. Well, an exposure might be that I am going to do an imaginal where I maybe just have a picture of Jesus in my mind. And I'm just going to look at Jesus. And no matter what happens when I look at that picture of Jesus in my mind, I'm going to do nothing. I'm going to sit there. I'm going to do nothing to neutralize. I'm going to just focus on that. And there's different things we'll do to help, like hook statements, hook them into really focusing on that, not letting their brain get any level of relief. And we'll do that until that doesn't really trigger them. And then we get to a point where when that thought comes in, I can be like, yeah. Because guess what? Other people, even listening to this, who don't have OCD, when I just said that, they probably could have just had a thought like, inappropriate thing with Jesus. And they move on. They might even actually had an image flash in their brain for a moment, but because their brain didn't trigger, they move on. Somebody with OCD, they didn't move on. And so, these exposures are amazing, and being able to have somebody who holds you accountable, somebody who knows, who will sit down and do them with you, or even go out to the community. We call them in vivo exposures. Go out and go to the place where you need to do some of these exposures is amazing. And so I wonder if you guys have any questions for me, or.
Yeah, definitely. That was fantastic. I'll lead off with questions if that's okay. But Paul, yeah. I'll just say first, thank you so much. That was like so comprehensive and so real. So thanks for sharing all of that. When I think about the subject of this summit in particular, it sort of resonated when you were saying whatever you care about the most is, I don't remember how you said it exactly, but it's sort of what OCD is going to attack. And I have felt that very keenly in my experience with OCD. As an example, on my mission, it was the most important thing for me to be pure, so that I could have the Spirit, so that I could take the gospel to the people that needed it. And so OCD would attack my purity in a variety of ways, whether that was sexuality, harm, whatever, even contention, things like that. And it was, when you were like going through, what if you felt that for an hour? What if you felt that for a day? I was like, what if you felt that for 2 years? Because that was me.
Painful.
Exactly. Yeah, totally. And then later on, when I was applying to grad school, and I've mentioned this on our podcast, but that became the most important thing for me in that moment was to get into the school that I'd always wanted to go to. And after I had applied, I became completely convinced. Well, not convinced. It was the doubt. It was like about wondering if I had cheated on my application essay through getting it edited by a friend. And this drove me absolutely crazy. And I mean, Aubrey really helped me through this. I was ready. I was like basically composing the email to the dean of admissions saying like, hey, I cheated. Like, I'm going to leave this in your hands, which obviously is a totally crazy thing to do, but like, it was the only resolution that I could see, which, you know, obviously means that something was going on in my brain that didn't make any sense at all. But again, back to the sort of the subject of this particular conversation, I would imagine that especially in the church for single people, for a lot of them, maybe their top priority in life is to find their partner and get married. And so if that's true, that OCD attacks things that are most valuable to you, would you expect for many single Latter-day Saints that relationship OCD is sort of where it attacks?
Absolutely. That it is this doubt, you know. And here's the thing is that, I mean, again, like I said, if they really want to know if they're dealing with relationship OCD, it's very simple. Is that when they look at that person and then they start worrying about it, does it feel the same as if somebody's running at them with a machete? Then they probably have our relationship OCD. Because here's the thing, the other 98% of the people in the world who are in that exact same situation, they're not feeling that intensity. I mean, why in the blanky blankerson do I need that much emotion, even if it were true? Like, it doesn't make sense. Why should I? And so if I'm doubting, like, because here's the thing is like, if I don't like them, well, then I don't like them. But then I do like them. But every time I don't, it hurts. It's conflict. It is, the world disappears, and I am so focused on this. And in fact, I would actually say, I you know, this is not truth, but I feel like this is Satan's plan. OCD wants you to avoid doing anything, you know, to like if I can just hold you stuck in your life forever, then great. And that's what it is. Like, my wife, she actually made this most amazing analogy for me. She's like, my OCD is like a forest. And I go in this forest and there's 1,000 trees. And all of these trees are meant to be climbed and experienced and maybe fallen out of and reclimbed and grow. And I grow from this experience. But my brain is stuck on 4 or 5 trees. And that is where I, like, year after year after year, I keep losing like all these experiences. And I look at everyone else and they're climbing trees. They're fine. Why are they climbing trees? What's the difference? And I'd say the difference is that they don't have OCD. And so these single people, you know, if I am so like, I'm in this relationship and I'm so totally obsessed about it and I'm not really living life and enjoying life, it begs the question of whether they're stuck in relationship OCD.
Yeah. And I'm curious, Paul, like, one thing with this is, you know, creating this session, I definitely don't want to, you know, anchor the mind of leaders to think like, oh, they sort of have a hard time staying in a relationship. There must be some OCD there, right? So how common, like, if you're just statistically speaking in a sacrament meeting of 250 single adults, what percentage of them are actually going to experience OCD and maybe even relationship OCD?
5 to 6 of them have OCD.
Okay.
2%,
2.2, depends on who's doing the study.
Yeah.
And so
this shouldn't be some blanket like, oh, well, you should go see somebody about OCD just because they're maybe struggling with relationship.
That's correct. And those bishops who see somebody for the 15th time in a year about the same topic, I can guarantee you it's OCD. There's no reason why I need to talk about the same thing and just give more detail each and every time. But yeah, so yes, not everybody has it. But I do think that there are other things. So you've got generalized anxiety or social anxiety, and that can also have similar feelings in massive, huge emotion for the wrong experiences. So like, oh, I look at somebody, they look at me, and I get the same feeling as if somebody's running at me with a machete. Again, not supposed to happen. And so I think that can impact people's ability to get in relationships, because I've already decided in my brain, which is neutralizing, how somebody thinks and feels about me without them ever even having a conversation with them. And so,
yeah.
I wanted to ask you also, Paul, a lot of the examples that you gave made me think of how, you know, if you didn't have this paradigm of OCD, if you don't know that you have OCD yet, I feel like we have all the language we need to describe that experience of OCD religiously. And so I wonder if that makes it more difficult to recognize. And I wondered if you could address specifically like the steps to repentance, because I get that you were talking about something so different, but I just wonder if you had nothing to compare it to, you would think you were just following the steps of repentance. You were recognizing that you did something wrong, then you go confess it, and then you have this resolve to never do it again, and like you make restitution, and there's your compulsion, you know? And so how do you tell, and I think this is my same question with anxiety too, you know, how do you recognize the difference between warnings of the spirit and a prompting of the spirit and these totally different, you know, real physical like illnesses?
Well, I think that sometimes God can push urgency to somebody, but he doesn't push urgency off and on all day long, every week long, every month long, every year long. Like if you talk to somebody, you know, just a general person in the church, they say, yeah, I've probably felt that level of urgency with the spirit really urging me like once in my life.
That's a great point.
Like, how many times have you felt urgent? Like the spirit's like, oh my gosh, you need to go, and your kid is, you know, hanging off a limb, and they are.
Yeah.
Once, twice. It's not a daily occurrence, and when it is, that's not what the rest of the world is experiencing. Yeah. Something different.
That's a great point.
Let me. Oh, sorry, Aubrey.
Well, I was just going to say, okay, don't forget what you're going to say. I was just going to, I think, I just want you to stay here for one more second. I mean, is that how you recognize? Because it's so tricky the way it changes, that like something that you finally can totally define as OCD goes away, and then there's a new thing. And it seems like because certainty is always priority number one, of course, the first question is this really OCD this time? And it's always going to be like, probably not. No, this time it's real. Like this time this is, all these feelings are legitimate. And so is that your litmus test? Like, is the intensity itself the actual litmus test?
That's it. So here's the thing: is the topic is irrelevant. The topic doesn't matter. Yeah. We don't care about the topic. So, but I care about what you feel. That feeling over and for so long, and I mean 2 years of suffering because you want to be a good guy, you know, and. Like, I'm sorry, that's just not what's supposed to happen. And so, again, the average person, do you have anxiety that lasted 1 whole hour? I had a child die at birth. And at most, I probably was like 1 or 2 minutes of anxiety, and then it would go away, and then maybe an hour later. But I did not have 1 whole day of pain-wrenching anxiety. Within that time when we were in the hospital, we laughed, we joked, we cried, we laughed, we joked, we cried, we felt anxious, we laughed, we cried. I mean, lots of emotions. But somebody who has anxiety, it is one emotion. It is one emotion, and it's a lot. And like I said, it shouldn't happen that often. And if it does, why? Like, God does not show me a scripture that's how God rolls.
Right.
That's so helpful. Yeah.
Let me, and actually my question was quite similar, but to just take it from a slightly different angle, I imagine that there are listeners right now listening to this podcast or this summit that are thinking maybe like it might be a glimmer of hope, you know, like, is it possible that I have OCD and that I'm not actually a psychopath, or that I'm not actually a pedophile? And I think one of the fears, and like, but I'm worried that they'll listen to this and be like, no, you know, these thoughts, like you're saying, they're so real. And like part of the fear is if I go into a therapist and say what I'm thinking, like I'm going to be carted away in handcuffs.
Oh yeah.
So how do you like do you have words of encouragement for people that are feeling that maybe slight glimmer of hope, but it's not quite enough to like actually go?
Yes. Well, I would tell you that like these fears of harm or being a pedophile, like 1 in 3 people with OCD have those. They're that common. And it's like, I've heard it over and over again. You know, they're terrified. Like, I don't want to tell somebody because I will go to prison, or I'm going to lose my membership, or I'm never going to live the life I'm supposed to live. And I would say that go to somebody who is actually specialized. They don't do anything else. This is what they work on. they're not going to behave that way, because they're like, oh yeah, you worried about sexually abusing your child last night? Oh, okay. You know,
Yeah.
you might be like, oh shoot, because the therapist is going to know, well, guess what? A pedophile who sexually abuses a child, they're excited. The only time they're terrified is when they think that somebody saw what they were doing. Somebody who has pedophile OCD, they're terrified that they might have liked it or not liked it. They might have done something, or might have wanted to do something, or maybe they felt a sexual feeling, and they're just so traumatized by that. And so the hope is that just go to somebody and do a test. If you just do a talk, that's not enough. You have them do the, they need to give you the Y box, the Yale Brown OCD inventory. It's an amazing one. It's a self one. You can actually probably find it online. Go to our website. You can find it on there. It's a beginning, so I'd say just if you go to the right person, then you're not going to have a problem. And the right person is, ask them, there's actually 7 questions on the International OCD Foundation website. And these 7 questions, hey, if you ask these questions, they can't say yes to all of them, don't go to them, because they won't be able to help you. And so that's the way. It's like, hey, don't have to disclose anything that they're worried about. Ask those 7 questions. If they can, they got it.
Could you take a minute, Paul, and just explain what's happening? You mentioned the frontal cortex, but I wondered if you could just explain what is getting stuck there. And you said it's a physical illness. So I think it might be useful to just understand like what is actually happening in the brain that allows anxiety to last this long and with this intensity.
So one person, the specialist guy, explained it to me as though it's like this filter. And the filtering it's just not doing what it's supposed to do. And because of not, it's that amygdala keeps on reacting. It's sending adrenaline. It's activating the part of your brain that releases adrenaline, and then and it just keeps happening. And then the feeling of that you get, the reasoning part of your brain, it just circles over and over again. It's like they're working against each other but for each other, and so but here's the interesting thing is that I've worked with so many people who really want to understand why, and I'm telling you, it will do nothing. It's like me, if I could understand why did my daughter die, do I get her back once I figure it out? It is a farce to believe that by exploration I'm going to actually get better or feel better. I won't. All it will do is maybe give me relief if I can get some resolution. But with OCD, it resets. The brain resets within seconds, minutes, moments.
Wow.
Into it.
So Paul, I'm curious, just from what I've learned from Tim and others is that, maybe in a leadership context, someone coming to a bishop or not, that the natural response is to reassure people, right? Like, oh yeah, this isn't a bad relationship. He's a great guy. Like, I don't know why you're worrying about these things, and I mean, that seems completely natural to do. So I'm curious, and obviously if they need that help with OCD, it's probably not going to get solved just in the bishop's office. They need to refer to someone like you. But so what might this sound like in the context of a bishop's office, and how could maybe a leader respond to someone who's really struggling with doubt in a relationship context?
Well, so that's a good question. So the bishop is not the professional. The bishop is there to help their spiritual being, right? And what they need to do is encourage them to get support from a specialist. That really is, because what will happen is they'll just get gobbled up by all these things that this person is saying. And I'm telling you, that person, when they're going to that bishop, it all sounds so legit. It's serious. And it's going to be talked as it's serious, but then they come back again the next week or 2 weeks later or a month later, and they're talking about the same thing again and the same thing. So what the bishop can say is, hey, this is now the third time that you come in, or second time, or 15th time you come in. You know what? This is bigger than a conversation with me. This is something that you need to work with a professional on, because this is not about the relationship. This is about what your brain is doing. At least that's what I was taught. So go to a professional. And so
that's helpful. And it sounds like that's maybe the red flag that leaders could look for, is like the repeated attempts of like, I thought you brought this same concern about this relationship before. And again, I don't think, obviously the bishop's office, typically people are going for transgression purposes, but maybe from time to time they're struggling with deciding if this is their eternal mate, right? And they may take it there. But
and that's the thing is, like, unless they come back and they are truly sharing brand new information, like, oh yeah, actually this did happen, I didn't tell you it the first time, and it's a big deal. Like, okay, that's very different than like, well, let me change the semantics on how I shared it the first time and see if you have a different approach to respond to me with. Because I feel like you would maybe say something different this time.
I remember one therapist telling us that ERP is so good for anybody, even if you don't have OCD, that this is something that is just kind of a healthy practice to stop leaning into anxiety and just get used to just this idea of totally accepting thoughts that come and go, And so I wondered if there are other things that you imagine our community working on. I think we talk about certainty, like it's really a value. And are there ways that you think we could make our community as a whole, OCD or not, just a healthier place mentally?
I think we need to, like, even starting in our own families, that we need to recognize what's going on, because a lot of times we focus on the behavior, but we don't focus on the actual problem. So like my kid, they won't let me leave the nursery because they're screaming and crying. They've got separation anxiety. Well, but I'm focusing on that behavior, not like, oh my goodness, maybe there's actually something bigger than them that's happening in their brain. And so I think that as a community, we can encourage, or in our families and community, we can encourage people to face fear, because I totally agree with you. I think exposure and response prevention is actually part of God's plan. God did it. He wants us to climb those trees. He wants us to risk the possibility of falling out of them. I don't know what the end is going to be, but I do know that staying in a protected space goes opposite of why I'm here. I'm here to be tested, to be tried, to have experiences, to grow. Who I am today is not who I was 20 years ago. When I was 17 years old, I moved out of my parents' house. My parents and I were fighting all the time because I'd stay up to like 2 or 3 in the morning on school night. I had no idea what my parents' problem was. I look back at it now, I'm like, oh my gosh, my poor parents. I can't believe it. I'm not that same dumb 17-year-old. And how can I grow if I'm preventing myself because I'm so afraid? And so again, like community, what they can do is encourage people to get into treatment. Like, stop talking about it. Stop talking will not get it better. Doing something about it will get it better. So I think instead of laughing and thinking it's funny or thinking that they should be able to deal with it, I mean, that is like, I think as a community, we have more compassion and stop seeing anxiety or OCD as the world portrays it. It isn't what they think, what they portray. It isn't funny, and it's not all under your control. That, I'm sorry, your brain, like somehow the world believes a physical disorder is an acceptable excuse for why you can't do something. But a mental health issue, there is no excuse. You need to try harder. You need to do more. You need to read your scriptures. You need to be more obedient. You need to really, and if that person had a compound fracture, would you say, did you write in your journal about it? So that's going to make their arm better?
Right.
No.
Yeah.
Wow. Thank you. Any other questions from our panel here?
I think I'm set. This has been so fantastic, Paul. Thank you.
Yeah.
This is great.
To be here.
Paul, I guess I got one more question for you. Before we do that, if people do want to get more familiar with your clinic, your resources, and the treatments you offer, where would you send them to learn more?
They could just go to our website, the OCD and Anxiety Treatment Center, or call 298-2000. That's our phone number. But and we're not the only ones who know how to do it. People do. You just have to work hard to find who they are.
Yeah.
And then the last question I have is, imagine you're a room full of bishops, Relief Society presidents, maybe family members of single adults. In the context of relationship OCD, what final encouragement would you give them?
What I would say is that the people they're working with, they will never, like in that moment when before they've started treatment, will never be able to comprehend being past this, beyond this. But through treatment, but when they get to the other side and these things are not bothering them, they're able to get through things so much faster, and they're not suffering every day. The silent sufferers, right? And so let's tell these brethren, or leaders, is get them into treatment. And even though they have people who are going to be so skeptical, guess what? They can live productive lives. But that productive life isn't going to come by the traditional way that the world says it. And so get them into treatment. Stop talking. Like, again, they keep on going to the medical issue. Like, I'm sorry, but if you ask that same question and they said, but they have a metal bar sticking out of their head, what would you tell these leaders? I tell the leaders, you should probably encourage them to go to the doctor.
Yeah.
Like, what else am I supposed to do? They need to go to the doctor. Just because you can see the metal bar doesn't actually mean it's worse than somebody who has OCD, where their brain is lit up like a Christmas tree for days or weeks or months or years on end.
Yeah.
Yeah. That was great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul.
That was amazing. Yeah. Thanks so much for listening to this episode. We really hope that you found it helpful. We're leaving links to the resources mentioned in the show notes, including to the website of the International OCD Foundation, where you can search for qualified OCD therapists, and to Paul's organization that's operating in Utah, the OCD and Anxiety Treatment Center. Again, if you have a loved one who may be suffering from OCD, please feel free to share this episode with them. And if you yourself are an OCD sufferer, we're sending our love and asking you to please utilize the resources listed, as we have. We know that they can change your life. Thanks always for listening to the podcast, and remember, you can check out more at faithmatters.org.